This is my final presentation for Human Anatomy and Physiology 1, and as you can tell from the cheesy pun that here at the top, the topic is on the heart. First of all, there's gonna be a lot of this humor sprinkled throughout, so you know, just to let you know about that. And also, if you hear slushing in the background, I'm going to be drinking water throughout this presentation. So, yeah, just to let you know about that. Alright, so some foundational stuff first. The heart is one of the most important muscles in the body. Without the heart, the body itself wouldn't be able to function, even on a cellular level. It wouldn't be able to function, and I'll get into that later. The heart, in terms of its position, it's medial to the lungs and posterior to the sternum. So as you can see here, where's my cursor at? Here we go. So as you can see here, I know this diagram's a little blurry, but apologies for that. So we've got the sternum here, we have the lungs, and then of course we have the heart here. So that kind of gives you an idea of its anatomical position. The next 5 slides are going to be dealing with the heart's anatomy and the major parts that make it up. So as you can see here, we have a rough diagram of the heart's gross anatomy, and we have it in an anterior view. So, like I said, here you've got all of the parts neatly labeled here, just to kind of show you sort of the ins and outs of the organ itself. And then here I've just kind of condensed all of these into list form. So now we're going to talk about the heart's size, its location, and its orientation. So the heart itself is about the size of a fist, and it's hollow and cone-shaped. And it's enclosed within the mediastinum, otherwise known as the thorax's medial cavity. The heart's base is about 9 centimeters wide and is directed toward the right shoulder. And also the heart's apex points the heart's apex points inferiorly toward the left hip. So by apex, of course, I mean this section here at the very bottom. Here at the very bottom, which makes sense because if you are standing up, right? If you're standing upright, you are, it's going to be pointing towards the left. So toward the left hip, and you can easily feel the amicable impulse, otherwise known as the heartbeat in layman's terms. You can easily feel the amicable impulse caused by the beating heart's apex when it touches the chest wall, and a good way to do this is by just touching your heart, right? Like, say, when you stand for the Pledge of Allegiance at a baseball game or something, and the host basically says, place your hand over your heart, you can feel the heart actively beating against the chest wall. So that kind of explains that. The next 4 slides are going to be talking about the coverings of the heart along with the heart wall. So the heart is enclosed in the pericardium, a double-walled sac with the fibrous pericardium protecting the heart and anchoring it to surrounding structures. The pericardium also prevents it from being overfilled with blood. And within the fibrous pericardium is something called the parietal layer, which attaches to the large arteries exiting the heart, and then it turns inferiorly and continues over the external heart surface as the visceral layer. This is also called the epicardium, which basically means upon the heart. And this epicardium is a massive part of the heart wall. The pericardial cavity ultimately allows the heart to work in a relatively friction-free environment. In other words, These cavities both protect the heart and allow it to function with fluidity. Alright, so moving on to the heart wall and its layers. So the heart wall is composed of 3 layers. We've already talked about one of them briefly. So the 3 layers are the epicardium, the myocardium, and the endocardium. And an easy way to remember that the heart is a cardiac muscle, which it is just by... Where's my cursor at? Apologies, I keep losing track of it. An easy way to remember that the heart is a cardiac muscle, which again it is by paying attention to this here, the cardi. Here. Right? Because cardiovascular, right? So that's just an easy way to remember that these are connected to the heart. The epicardium is often infiltrated with fat, particularly when it comes to the older aged or elderly. The second layer, the myocardium, is composed mostly of cardiac muscle. See, there's that cardiac again, or cardia rather. So let me repeat that. So the myocardium is composed mostly of cardiac muscle, and it forms the bulk of the heart. It's also the layer that contracts, and it contains branching cardiac muscle cells that are connected via connective tissue bundles, which all link the individual parts of the heart together. Beyond this, the myocardium itself is supported by the cardiac skeleton that's formed by the connective fibers. And then, of course, moving on to the third layer here, we've got the endocardium. So the endocardium is a glistening white sheet of endothelium, resting on a thin connective tissue. And its function, the endocardium's function, is to basically line the heart chambers and cover the fibrous skeleton of the valves. So, for example, here you've got a diagram here, right? So here is the skeleton, right? This would be the skeleton, and here is the epicardium. So basically, it goes, and it kind of fits into the square here, right? This is just a visual way of understanding this. All right, now we're gonna talk about the sides of the heart. So as you can see here, before I actually read this text, you've got a diagram here. So you've got the body here, the right ventricle, the left ventricle, and then you have the lungs all the way up here at the top. I'll explain what all of this means as I go through this. So the right side of the heart receives oxygen-poor blood from body tissues, and then it pumps this blood to the lungs to pick up the oxygen and dispel carbon dioxide. So for example, right, when you breathe in, you're breathing in oxygen, but when you breathe out, you're breathing out carbon dioxide. So the blood vessels that carry blood to and from the lungs form what's called the pulmonary circuit, and the pulmo basically just means lung. So here's a visual demonstration of this. So as you can see from this legend, the oxygen poor blood is blue. So this is the right ventricle. So it goes from the body. So again, when we breathe in, it goes from the body through the right ventricle into the right atrium, into the pulmonary arteries, and then to the lungs. Excuse me. And then to the lungs. Okay, now moving on to the left side of the heart. The left side of the heart receives the now oxygenated blood. So again, because again on this side you have oxygen poor blood, it goes to the lungs, and once it's filtered through the lungs, it becomes oxygen rich. As you can see here by the legend being red, you know, this is oxygen rich blood now. So The left side receives the oxygenated blood returning from the lungs and pumps this blood throughout the body to supply oxygen and nutrients to body tissues. The blood vessels that carry blood to and from all body tissues form the systemic circuit. So, if you remember before, we were talking about what make up the pulmonary circuit. Now we're talking about this systemic circuit down here. So, kind of completing this metaphor here, or not metaphor, but this visual journey, I guess. So you've got the oxygen poor blood, right? It comes into the lungs and it gets filtered. Once the filtering's done, it becomes oxygen rich. And so basically what happens is it leaves the lungs, goes down here through the pulmonary veins, through the left atrium and left ventricle, as well as to the heart itself, and then it loops all the way around through the aorta and its branches, all the way around to the body. So it's like a massive loop. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the heart's chambers. So first of all, we've got something called the right atrium, which is here, right? And this right atrium basically receives the blood that's deoxygenated returning from the systemic circuit. So for example, here again, you've got the oxygen poor blood. It comes in when we breathe in, and it goes into that right atrium, which again is what ultimately receives the blood and passes it on to the through the rest of the process to the lungs where it's filtered. So and now we've got the adverse. We've got the left atrium now. So the left atrium is basically what receives the blood from the pulmonary circuit. It receives the now oxygenated blood from the pulmonary circuit, because again, you've got the right atrium. It sends it on into the lungs. It gets filtered. Again, it becomes oxygen rich. Then it goes again down here and into that left atrium, where it's received and then pumped to the rest of the body. Alright, so now we're going to move on and talk about chambers and vessels. So the heart itself is divided into 4 chambers. We've already talked about 2 of them, but before we move on to the other 2, we've got to define some terms first. The inner atrial septum divides the heart longitudinally. The interventricular septum separates the ventricles. The coronary sulcus encircles the junction of the atria. The anterior interventricular sulcus marks the anterior position of the septum, separating the right and left ventricles. The posterior interventricular sulcus provides a similar landmark on the heart's posterior-inferior surface. Alright, so now going back to this diagram here, we've got the right ventricle, which is over here. And the right ventricle is the thing that actually pumps the blood into the pulmonary circuit. So again, once it's done here in the right atrium, it goes down here to the right ventricle, and that's what actually pumps it up. Pumps it up into the pulmonary circuit itself, where the lungs are. On the flip side of that, we've got the left ventricle. And the left ventricle is what pumps the blood into the systemic circuit. So again, you've got the oxygen poor blood. It comes in, is filtered through the lungs. It's pumped in by the right ventricle. Comes in, gets filtered by the lungs, and then becomes oxygen rich. Comes down into the left atrium, and then to the left ventricle, where it's pumped throughout the rest of the body into the systemic circuit. All right, so now we're going to talk about a tale of two atrias, if you will. So the left and right atria are free of distinguishing surface features, surprisingly. The right atrium has 2 parts. Or 2 pectinate muscles. These pectinate muscles basically have both a posterior and an anterior region. The left atrium is mostly smooth, and the pectinate muscles are only found in the auricle. The atria are the receiving chambers for blood that's returning to the heart from the circulation. Alright, so now we're going to talk about blood and the atria. Blood enters the right atrium via 3 veins. You've got the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus. What exactly are these things? I'm glad you asked. So the superior vena cava returns blood from body regions that are superior to the diaphragm. So if you can picture a body diagram, you've got the diaphragm where the stomach is. The superior regions are basically any regions that are above the diaphragm. So for example, you've got the chest, right? You've got the major pectoral, right? The superior vena cava would basically return blood from those body regions, from the pectoris major. All right, now we've got the inferior vena cava, and this returns blood from body regions that are below the diaphragm. So once again, for example, like looking at our kind of imaginary body diagram, you've got again the diaphragm, but below that you have like major muscles like the quadriceps and hamstrings, for example. The inferior vena cava essentially returns blood from these regions. Meanwhile, the coronary sinus is what collects the blood draining from the myocardium. There are also 4 pulmonary veins that enter the left atrium, which makes up most of the heart's base. And the veins transfer blood from the lungs back to the heart. So again, going back to our diagram here, I'm going to be referring to this diagram a lot, I think. So you've got the lungs here, right? And it's been filtered through. They go down, and the pulmonary veins are at work here. The pulmonary veins are at work at this stage in the process. So the pulmonary veins are what send it into the left atrium, to the heart through the left ventricle, and then again back down to the body, where the process basically repeats itself. Alright, so now we're going to talk about ventricles. The ventricles make up the majority of the heart's volume. I mean, you could probably tell that from the diagram, right? The internal walls of the chambers are marked by ridges of muscle called the trabeculae craniae. The papillary muscles play a role in valve function. The ventricles themselves are basically the pumps of the heart. The right ventricle pumps the blood into the pulmonary trunk, which routes the blood to the lungs where gas exchange occurs. So again, going back to our diagram here, you've got the right ventricle, right? And it's pumping the blood through the right atrium here, right? Through the right atrium into the right ventricle, and then it pumps the blood to the lungs. Meanwhile, the left ventricle basically pumps it to the rest of the body, but I'll get to that in a second. Okay, so like I said before, the left ventricle ejects the blood into the aorta. So again, going back to the diagram here, So again, going back to the diagram here, you got the left ventricle. It pumps the blood into the aorta here. So again, you've got the left ventricle, and it pumps the blood right into the aorta, where it's then sent to the rest of the body. The aorta is also the largest artery in the body. Alright, so now we're going to talk about valves and blood flow. There are 2 AV valves. There's one located at each atrioventricular junction. These AV valves basically prevent the backflow of blood into the atria when the ventricles themselves contract. The right AV valve is called the tricuspid valve, and it has 3 flexible cusps. The left AV valve is called the mitral cuff, and it only has 2. The mitral valve. I apologize for that. Actually, let me start that one over. The left AV valve is also called the mitral valve, and it only has 2 cusps. It's also called the bicuspid valve as well. Attached to each of these valves, so again, you've got the left AV valve and the right AV valve, right? So attached to each of these guys are tiny white collagen cords. These cords are called chordae tenyae. These cords anchor the cusps to the papillary muscles, so basically they make them stay in place. The muscles themselves are protruding from the ventricular walls. The tendinae are also called the heartstrings because again they're keeping everything in place. And the tendinae and the papillary muscles both tether and anchor the valves in their closed position. Alright, in their closed position. The aortic and pulmonary valves guard the base of the large arteries issuing from the ventricles, and they also prevent backflow into the associated ventricles. These valves are also called this is also called the semilunar or SL valve. The SL valves open and close in response to differences in pressure, much like the AV valves do, right? Now bear in mind, there are small amounts of blood that do end up spurting back into the right and left atria during atrial contraction. However, the backflow is minimal due to the inertia of the blood, and because when it contracts, the atrial myocardium compresses and collapses the entry points. Okay? So again, even though there is a small amount of backflow of blood, it's minimal due to these factors. Alright, so now we've got a diagram here of blood flow. So once again, much like the other diagram, you have oxygen poor blood and oxygen rich blood. And oxygen rich blood indicated by changes of color. So the blue blood here, the blue blood here again at this point it's oxygen poor. So it comes from the heart, right? It comes from the heart into the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus. Then it goes from here to the right atrium. From there it goes to the right ventricle via the tricuspid valve. From there it goes to the pulmonary trunk via the pulmonary semilunar valve. And then from here it goes to the lungs. And again, this is where the filtering takes place and it becomes oxygen rich. So once it's done being filtered, it goes to the heart, and the 4 pulmonary veins in the heart then send the oxygen-rich blood now to the left atrium. The left atrium then sends the oxygen-rich blood to the left ventricle via the mitral valve, the mitral valve. My bad. And then finally the left ventricle sends it to the aorta via the aortic semilunar valve. And then, once again, it's sent back to the body, and then the process repeats itself at the next breath. Alright, so now we're going to talk about something called coronary circulation. The heart, this is how the heart gets nourishment. And the coronary circulation is the functional blood supply of the heart, and it's also the shortest circulation in the body. The left coronary artery runs down the left side of the heart and then divides into 2 major branches. okay? It divides into two major branches. The anterior interventricular artery supplies blood to the interventricular septum and the anterior walls of both ventricles. The circumflex artery supplies the left atrium and the posterior walls of the left ventricle. The right coronary artery courses to the right side of the heart, where it also gives rise to two branches, like the left one does. In the case of the right coronary artery, its two branches are called the right marginal artery, which serves as the myocardium of the lateral right side of the heart, and the second branch is called the posterior interventricular artery. This artery runs to the heart apex and supplies the posterior ventricular walls. Near the apex of the heart, so again, that bottom section, if you remember from the first diagram, near the apex of the heart, this artery merges with the anterior interventricular artery. And together, the branches of the right artery supply the right atrium and nearly the entirety of the right ventricle. Okay, so we're going to continue talking about coronary circulation here. Cardiac veins are compressed. The cardiac veins are compressed to form an enlarged vessel called the coronary sinus, which is what empties the blood into the right atrium. The sinus has three large parts to it. So the first part and the largest part is the great cardiac vein, which is the middle interventricular sulcus. The second part is the middle cardiac vein, which is the posterior interventricular sulcus. And the third one is the small cardiac vein, which runs along the heart's right inferior margin. There are several cardiac veins that also empty directly into the right atrium anteriorly. Alright, so now we're going to do a little bit of a comparison. We're going to talk about the heart in comparison to other muscle groups, okay? So, like I mentioned before, the heart is a cardiac muscle. What I mean by that is that it's short, it's fat, it's branched, and it's interconnected. The heart beats or contracts as a single unit. An easy way to kind of visualize this in your mind is by thinking of a crane lowering, okay? So imagine that you're at a construction site and you see a crane that's being used. Maybe it's lifting a beam into the air or something like that, but it lowers down, right? And then it grabs on to that beam, and then it raises it back up. And then it raises it up into the air to do whatever the construction team is going to do with it. Alright. So, unlike skeletal muscle, there are gap junctions between the cells of cardiac muscle. The gap junctions themselves create a functional syncytium. Cardiac muscles, including the heart, also have one or two nuclei per cell. And on top of that, the heart also relies exclusively on aerobic respiration. Okay, so again, the heart also relies exclusively on aerobic respiration. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the heart's physiology and its functions. So, action potentials are triggered throughout the heart by what are called pacemaker cells, okay? Pacemaker cells. So here you have a diagram of what a pacemaker cell looks like. So you have all the individual parts here that are labeled nicely. Very intricate. Very, very intricate. Okay, so the function of the heart is due to two factors. Okay, it's due to two factors. One is the presence of gap junctions. The second is the activity of the heart's in-house conduction system called the intrinsic cardiac conduction system. Okay, the intrinsic cardiac conduction system. This system consists of non-contractile cardiac cells that are specialized to initiate and distribute impulses throughout the heart. And this is done so that the heart can depolarize and contract in sequence. Okay, it's done so that the heart can depolarize and contract in sequence. Pacemaker cells, the cells that I mentioned before, have the ability to depolarize spontaneously. And because of this, they can actually pace the heart. These guys also have an unstable resting potential. Pacemaker potentials initiate the action potentials that spread throughout the heart to trigger its contractions. So an easy way to visualize this is, you've got a car, right? Let's imagine that you've got a car and you're trying to get it to start. Obviously you've got the engine that revs up when you want to go somewhere, but what do you have to do to actually get somewhere? You have to step on the gas. The pacemaker potentials are basically the gas for the action potentials. And speaking of action potentials, there are actually three parts to them. One is a pacemaker potential, two is depolarization, and three is repolarization. We'll go through each of these briefly. Pacemaker potential is due to the special properties of the ion channels in the sacrolemma. Hyperpolarization at the end of an action potential both closes the K+ channels and opens slow Na+ channels, making the membrane interior less negative and more positive. Now, it's the influx of Ca2+ rather than Na+ that produces this rising phase of the action potential and reverses the membrane potential. So again, this is basically what makes the membrane less negative. In repolarization, Ca2+ channels are inactive, reflecting the opening of K+ channels and K+ efflux from the cell. Once the repolarization is complete, the process essentially repeats itself, just because, again, it's an ongoing thing, and it's happening with every single breath that we take. Okay? It's happening with every single breath that we take. Okay, so now we have a diagram about the sequence of excitation. So what you've got here is you've got the sinoatrial node, which generates the impulses. So it's this part down here. Whoops, sorry, the big yellow part, my bad. So you've got the node here. So once those impulses are generated, they're paused at the atrioventricular node. So this part here. Once that's done, there's the atrioventricular bundle connects the atria to the ventricles. Okay, it connects the atria to the ventricles. So this part here. Then you've got a continuation of the impulse. So these bundle branches, these two parts here, conduct the impulses through the interventricular septum. Through the interventricular septum. And then you've got this part here called the subendocardial conducting network, which depolarizes the contractile cells of both ventricles. All right. Now we're going to talk about cardiac centers. Now we're going to talk about cardiac centers. The cardiac centers are located in the medulla oblongata. The cardioacceleratory center projects the sympathetic neurons in the T1 through T5 channel level of the spinal cord. This cardiovascular center, it sends impulses to the parasympathetic dorsal vagus nucleus in the medulla, which in turn sends impulses to the heart via the branches of the vagus nerves. Most of the parasympathetic postganglionic motor neurons lie within ganglia in the heart wall, with their fibers projecting most heavily in the SA and AV nodes. Alright, so now we've got like a diagram of the action potentials of contractile cardiac muscle cells. So, of course, here the first part is depolarization. This is due to an influx in Na+, through the fast voltage gated Na+ channels. A positive feedback cycle rapidly opens many Na+ channels, reversing the membrane potential. So again, it reverses the potential itself. Channel inactivation ultimately ends this phase. And number 1 on the diagram is right here. Number 2 was what's called the plateau phase, and this plateau phase is due to an influx of Ca2+ through the slow Ca2+ channels. This keeps the cell depolarized because most of the K+ channels are closed at this point. So here's number 2, and of course you got the plateau. And then number 3 is where, step 3 is where repolarization comes in, and this is due to the Ca2+ channels inactivating and the K+ channels opening again. So this, obviously because the channel opened, it allows for a K+ efflux, which brings the membrane potential back to its resting voltage. So again, it kind of returns it to normal. And here's number 3. Alright, now we're going to get into some practical stuff. This is, now we're going to be talking about an EKG. An EKG is a composite of all the action potentials generated by nodal and contractile cells at a given time. And it's done through the placement of electrodes all along the body's surface. A typical EKG has 3 almost immediately distinguishable waves, or deflections. The P wave, the QRS complex, and the T wave. The P wave lasts about 1/8 of a second. It happens because of the movement of the depolarization from the SA node through the atria. The QRS complex is also, it's about the same length, it's about 1/8 of a second, and it happens as a result of ventricular depolarization. Meanwhile, the T wave lasts a little bit longer. It lasts about 1/16 of a second, and it's caused by ventricular, and it's also caused by ventricular depolarization. So now you have like a diagram of what an EKG looks like. Okay, so you have a diagram of what the EKG looks like along with all the various parts that we talked about. So you've got the QS complex, the P wave, and so on. Alright, so now we're going to talk about a few other parts that were in the diagram but that I didn't mention before. So first you have something called the PR interval, and this is the time from the beginning of atrial excitation to the beginning of ventricular excitation. So basically it's the time between that transfer. And this is sometimes called the PQ interval. It includes atrial depolarization and contraction along with the passage of the depolarization wave through the rest of the conduction system. The ST segment is basically when the entire myocardium, the entire ventricular myocardium, is depolarized. The QT interval lasts about 1/38 of a second, and it's the period from the beginning of ventricular depolarization through ventricular repolarization. Again, it's the period from the beginning of ventricular depolarization through ventricular repolarization. So it's like from one side of the fence to the other. Alright, now we're going to talk about something called the cardiac cycle. First, we've got to define some terms. We have the systole, which refers to periods of the heart's contraction. We have diastole, which refers to periods of the heart's relaxation. And then we have the cardiac cycle itself. The cardiac cycle itself includes all of the events associated with the blood flow through the heart during a single heartbeat. Atrial systole and diastole, followed by ventricular systole and diastole. Alright, so now you have like a diagram of what the cardiac cycle looks like. looks like. So it begins here at the AV valves. Let me just find where that is. Yeah. So the AV valves close when the ventricular pressure exceeds the atrial pressure. Okay, so it's when the ventricular pressure exceeds the atrial pressure. Then going up here to number 2, you've got this is where the semilunar valves open because of what number 1 did. Because of the excess in ventricular pressure. Then it goes over here to number 3. This is where the SL valves close, and the reason why they close is because the ventricular pressure drops below the aortic pressure. Blood in the aorta actually rebounds against the closed valve, causing the pressure to rise briefly at the dicrotic notch. And then you're going down here to number 4, where the AV valves open again because the ventricular pressure has dropped below the atrial pressure. Okay, so the P wave, which is where atrial depolarization happens, precedes atrial contraction. Okay, it precedes atrial contraction. The QRS complex, which is where ventricular depolarization happens, precedes ventricular contraction. Okay, it precedes ventricular contraction. And then you've got the T wave itself, which is where ventricular repolarization happens. It precedes ventricular relaxation. So again, the repolarization has to happen before the relaxation can take place. Alright, now we're going to talk about the phases of the cardiac cycle. Okay, the phases of the cardiac cycle. Apologies for that. Okay, so we've got ventricular filling. So this is in mid to late diastole. The pressure in the heart is low at this phase, and more than 80% of the ventricular filling happens in this stage. Atrial pressure rises and it propels the blood out of the ventricles, allowing the atria to relax. Alright, next you've got the isovolumetric contraction. This is where the ventricles contract because of atrial relaxation. The ventricular pressure exceeds the pressure in the large arteries, forcing the SL valves to open. Next, you've got the ventricular ejection. This is where blood rushes into the atria and pulmonary trunk. So again, if you can imagine the diagram that we were looking at of blood flow. So you've got so after the blood is filtered through the lungs, it goes into the aorta and pulmonary trunk. It's pumped in there via the left ventricle. Then you have the isovolumetric relaxation. This is where the SL valves close, causing the ventricles themselves to relax. Alright, so this is kind of where it returns to its starting phase. Alright, so, excuse the pun at the top. So, now we're going to talk about the sound the heart makes. Alright, we're going to talk about the sound that the heart makes. Often, it's described as lub-dub, right? It's like boom, 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 right? It's associated with the closing of the heart's valves. So, basically the sound that we hear happens when the valves close. The basic rhythm of the heart sounds is lub-dub, pause, lub-dub, pause, and so on. The pausing itself indicates that the heart is relaxing. Now the first sound, the lub-dub, the initial lub-dub, occurs as the AV valves close, and it signifies the point when ventricular pressure rises above atrial pressure. It also tends to be louder, longer, and more resonant than the second sound is. The second sound, which is the pause, occurs as the SL valves snap shut at the start of ventricular relaxation, resulting in a shorter and sharp sound. Alright, so now we're going to talk about stroke volume and heart rate regulation. Okay? So, there's something called cardiac output, and this is the amount of blood that's pumped out of each ventricle in 1 minute, okay, in a 1 minute time frame. And it's the product of both heart rate and stroke volume. Stroke volume is the volume of blood pumped out by one ventricle with each beat, alright? The average resting rate for the heart is 75 beats per minute, and the normal adult blood level is about 5 liters, or roughly a gallon. The cardiac output increases as the heart beats faster. The cardiac reserve is the difference between resting and maxing normal cardiac output. An example of this is on the next slide. Alright, so we've got 2 people here, right? And we're going to talk about a tale of 2 heartbeats. So each of these guys are on a treadmill, as you can see here, right? I don't run, but I do walk at a steady incline. But that's besides the point. So obviously the guy walking, his heart rate is going to be much lower than the guy running is, because by running you're exerting the body and you're basically forcing the blood. You're forcing the heart to pump more blood into the associated muscles. So, for example, I don't know if this guy's walking on an incline. It looks like he's doing steady state cardio. But regardless, an incline would certainly raise this fellow's heart rate, just because again you're working at an incline as opposed to being flat. Okay, so now we're going to talk about something called cardiac output factors. Okay, cardiac output factors. So as you can see by the legend here, you've got an initial stimulus in red, you have a physiological response, and then you have a result. Okay, so let's imagine our friend running on the treadmill again. Okay, so you've got this up here, right? You've got exercise. So let's say, for example, that he's running on the treadmill, right? Like I said before. So the increase in this would lead to an increase in venous return, which would lead to an increase in EDV, leading to an increase in stroke volume, and ultimately leading to an increase in cardiac output. Just because, again, he's exerting himself pretty heavily. So again, this is this also happens in the case of a rise in the ventricular filling time due to low heart rate. So again, the same thing would happen. But over here, though, you have what's called blood-borne epinephrine, thyroxine, and excess CA2. These 3 are hormones. Okay, these 3 are hormones. So here it would lead to an increase in the heart's contractility. It would lead to a decrease in ESV, and it would lead to an increase in stroke volume. But ultimately, it would lead to the same result, an increase in cardiac output. Here, you have a change in the autonomic central nervous system output. This is in response to exercise, fright, anxiety, or low blood pressure. So this will lead to a decrease in parasympathetic activity. Okay, a decrease in parasympathetic activity, but it'll mean an increase in sympathetic activity. Alright, an increase in sympathetic activity. This sympathetic activity will increase the heart's contractility, and then of course the rest of that part of the diagram would play out. But this increase in sympathetic activity would lead to an increase in heart rate. Alright, an increase in heart rate. Because again, let's say the person's frightened and they're running for their lives or something like that, or they're anxious or whatever, that's going to lead to an increase in heart rate, which ultimately means an increase in cardiac output. Okay, so now we're going to talk about something called the regulation of stroke volume. Okay, the regulation of stroke volume. Alright, so first of all, we have what's called the end diastolic volume. Okay, the end diastolic volume. This is the amount of blood that collects in a ventricle during diastole. Okay, so during that process. Next, we have what's called the end systolic volume. The end systolic volume. This is the volume of blood remaining in a ventricle after its contraction. Alright? And although many factors affect stroke volume by altering EDV or ESV, the three most important are preload, contractility, and afterload. Preload affects EDV, whereas contractility and afterload affect the ESV. Alright, so we're going to go on ahead and talk about preload first. So preload is what actually controls the stroke volume, and it's the degree to which cardiac muscles are stretched just before they contract. Okay? The relationship between the preload and the stroke volume is called the Frank-Starling law of the heart. And this is actually a diagram of the law itself, or rather, this part here is. So you got the EDV, the preload, and the SV here, the stroke volume, which leads to an increase in cardiac output. All right, next we're going to talk about contractility. This is the contractile strength achieved at a given muscle length. And contractility is independent of muscle stretch and EDV. Alright, it's independent of both those things. So again, here going back to this diagram, we have contractility down here. There's a rise in contractility as a result of these hormones. And now we're going to talk about afterload. This is the pressure that the ventricle needs in order to overcome, or rather, this is the pressure that the ventricle needs to overcome in order to eject blood, right? And in healthy individuals, afterload isn't really a major determinant. It's not really a deciding factor of stroke volume. This is because in healthy individuals, afterload is relatively constant. However, that changes when it comes to people that have hypertension or high blood pressure. In this case, afterload, in the case of the person with high blood pressure, afterload is extremely important because it reduces the ability of the ventricles to eject blood. Alright? So overall, it's in the high blood pressure individual, it's not a good thing. Alright, now we're going to talk about heart rate regulation. Alright, heart rate regulation. So the autonomic nervous system exerts the most important intrinsic controls in affecting heart rate. Alright, in affecting heart rate. And as you can see here, I've kind of chopped up that diagram. But this is basically what it's talking about when it's talking about the autonomic nervous system. So when changes in this nervous system happen, you have a decrease in parasympathetic activity, a rise in sympathetic activity, and ultimately a rise in heart rate. Alright. Heart rate is also regulated through chemical regulation. There are two hormones, epinephrine and thyroxine. Epinephrine enhances heart rate and contractility. Thyroxine acts directly on the heart, but it also enhances the effect of epinephrine and norepinephrine. Ions are very important because normal heart function depends on having a normal level of these intracellular and extracellular ions. There are also other factors when it comes to the chemical regulation of heart rate. For example, you have age, you have gender, you have the amount of exercise the person's getting, and of course you have the body temperature. Alright, so now we're going to talk about a heartbreaking situation. And this is called congestive heart failure. In congestive heart failure, the blood circulation is inadequate to meet the tissue's needs. There are some common causes of this. A few of them are coronary osteosclerosis, persistent high blood pressure, multiple myocardial infarctions, and a dilated cardiomyopathy. But there is a remedy. A potential remedy. Stem cell therapy could be used to reverse congestive heart failure. Specifically, cardiopoietic cells have been found to have an extremely beneficial effect for people with congestive heart failure. And in one study, it was found that data from the current study support the hypothesis that an optimal number of intramyocardial injections of cardiopoietic cells, which lead to favorable reverse LV remodeling in patients with advanced heart failure. These findings suggest that a moderate number of attempted injections should be implemented, probably between 15 to 19, in future studies of this therapy to achieve the optimal benefit. So basically, by injecting people with congestive heart failure with these cardiopoietic cells, it might reverse it. It might actually help them out with that. Meanwhile, looking at this from a biblical perspective, okay? Wrapping this all up and looking at this from a biblical perspective, the Bible is filled with figurative and symbolic language related to the heart. Proverbs 4:23, for instance, says, "Keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flow the springs of life." I'll read that again. Proverbs 4:23, for instance, says, "Keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flow the springs of life." Okay? To this passage, Garrett writes, "The metaphoric use of body parts permeates this text. The eyes are to stay fixed on right teaching, verses 21 and 25, as the feet are to stay in the right path, verses 26 to 27. The mouth and lips must shun using twisted words, verse 24. Above all, the heart must be guarded by sound doctrine, verse 21 and 23. If the son listens to his father, the whole body will be healthy, verse 22. The heart, verse 22 says, is the wellspring of life. Heart here, as always, refers not to the physical organ, but to the mind, and even the whole personality of the individual. It is the wellspring of life, in that the capacity to live with joy and vigor ultimately comes from within and not from circumstances. The corrupt heart draws one down to the grave, but wisdom protects the heart from that corruption. This verse, perhaps in conjunction with Ezekiel's vision of the river of life, Ezekiel 47, 1-12, apparently was the source of Jesus' perplexing citation in John 7:38. Okay, so the author of Hebrews writes in Hebrews 10:22, "Let us draw near with a true heart and full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water." A look at the Greek of this passage can help us get to its meaning. In the Greek, the phrase true heart is alethinos kardias. Halethinos kardias. There's a transliteration of it right there for you too. Meaning true heart. To this passage, Francis writes that a sincere heart and full assurance of faith speak of an open, transparent genuineness toward God and a robust trust in His promises. We shall hear much more of what faith implies in chapter 11, but linked with pleiophoria, full assurance. It indicates a confident reliance on God that has a far more sturdy quality than faith conveys to some today. The stem cell information in the study that I mentioned earlier showcases that there's a God-given cure for this ailment. Jesus is called the Great Physician because of the miracles he performed, both in the Gospels and throughout the biblical storyline itself, going all the way back to Genesis 1. Cross-reference this with John chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, where John, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, writes that the Word was already there. The Word being Jesus, and that Jesus was there in the beginning. Jesus was there in the beginning. In fact, Mark 2:17 states that, "And when Jesus heard it, he said to them, 'Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I come not to call the righteous, but sinners.'" And in Matthew 5:45, Jesus states, "So that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust." So, what does all this information mean? What does it point to or tell us about God? What can we learn from it? Three things. Number one, God is sovereign over everything in life. That is clear from Genesis 1 verse 1 all the way to the end of Revelation. Yahweh is sovereign. God is sovereign over everything in life. Number two, there is no ill that Jesus can't cure. Jesus fulfilled a total of 37 documented miracles in the four Gospels. In the four Gospel accounts. And he still performs them today through the various medicines that we have. Let's be honest here. God was the one who gave us the minds that we have. That gave scientists the minds that they have. And these scientists are able to use those minds to find these incredible medicines and remedies for the various ills that we have here on this earth. But don't forget, they would not be able to find any of these medicines or remedies if it was not for the grace of God allowing them to do that in the first place. And number three, Jesus, this is the core of the gospel message. Jesus came to save the lost, the sick, and the hurting. He came to save the lost, the sick, and the hurting. This ultimately points not only to our physical diseases, but also to our spiritual disease, sin and separation from God. Sin and separation from God. Now, bear in mind, God does not promise healing in this life. He does not promise healing in this life. But what he does is he promises new life. He promises a day for those of us who are in Christ. He promises a day when there will be no sickness. There will be no disease. There will be no more crying, no more pain. He promises that for everyone that is in Christ today, that puts their faith in Christ. In fact, I don't have the verse here, but Jesus says in John chapter 10, he says, "I am the door." He says, "I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture." The thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. Jesus came that we may have life and have it abundantly. And he offers that life freely to those who he offers that life freely through his gift of salvation. To conclude this massive presentation, the heart is a vital organ. And like I mentioned at the beginning of the PowerPoint, without the heart, the body itself wouldn't be able to function, even on a cellular level. The heart's anatomy, its physiology, and even the intricacy of its design all point back to our Creator. If the scriptures say that David was a man after God's own heart, I can only imagine the depths of his love for each one of us, ultimately expressed through the sacrifice of his Son and the gift of salvation that he freely offers. Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Psalm 37:4 says. That's a promise. That's a promise for believers. And I think that that's a promise that we can all hold on to wholeheartedly. Thank you so much for watching this this beefer of a video, no doubt. May the Lord bless you and keep you, and may his peace go with you.